Hello viewers, welcome to week 8, lecture 5 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. And in this lecture, I'm going to continue my discussion of reader response theorists and critics. We will be talking about two important uh, proponents of reader response theory, Hans Robert Joss and Stanley Fish in this lecture. Hans Robert Joss is an important German exponent of reception theory, and he has given a historical dimension to reader response criticism. What we find, particularly interesting in Joss, that how he tries to strike a middle ground between formalism and uh, interdisciplinary or biohistorical approaches of literature. For example, we find that how in formalist tradition, the text is given so much of importance that it ignores history and social theories. While when we talk about non-formalistic approaches, they often ignore the text. And in this way, Joss is trying to strike a balance between these two extremes. For example, Joss borrows the term paradigm from scientist T.S. Kuhn or philosophy of science of T.S. Kuhn. And this paradigm refers to the scientific framework of concepts and assumptions which is operating in a particularly given period. So, at a given period, what are the frameworks of concepts and assumptions which help a reader to understand a text or make sense of a text? These things are being indicated by Joss in his concept of paradigm. Joss is also known for the evolution of the concept of horizon of expectations. Horizon of expectations, it describes various criteria which are used by readers to make any literary judgment or make any sense of the world. So, in this way, these horizons of expectations or these criteria of making literary judgment or making sense of the text, they are not fixed. They keep varying from age to age, from decades to decades. And in this way, again, if we look at the act of interpretation, this making sense of a text, it happens to be a dynamic process, constantly changing, because horizon of our expectations are also changing. Right, so it will also cover what is to be regarded as poetic as opposed to unpoetic or non-literate uses of language. So here we find that very much like the new critics or formalists, especially like I.A. Richards and many new critics, Joss also believes in literary and non-literary uses of language, and these horizon of expectations, they also try to ascertain what are literary uses of language and what are non-literary uses of language. So in this way, ordinary writing and reading will work within such a horizon. The original horizon of expectation only tells us how the work was valued and interpreted when it appeared. It does not establish its meaning with finality. For example, in Joss's view, it would be equally wrong to say that a work is universal. That is, meaning is fixed forever and open to all readers in any period. So here we find that how this reader response criticism or reader response theory is very much in consonance with the post-structuralist notion of universals abandoned. We are living in a world where nothing holds a universal value, where Perhaps locals are there, not universals. Particulars are there, not generals. For example, Joss makes a reference to the writings of uh, Pope, Alexander Pope, who was, the renowned writer of the Augustan period. So he says that, if we talk about the original uh, horizon of expectations for Pope's work, so they were, criteria such as clarity, sincerity, or naturalness and stylistic decorum, which were the buzzwords to describe the neoclassical writings. So there, we find that how that was the origin of horizon of expectations in context of Pope. But when we move towards the second half of the 18th century, or we can say when this romantic movement was rising, Pope's reputation fell, and many times, critics were very negatively critical of Pope's writing. They said that Pope did not possess that power of imagination, which is the hallmark of great poetry, or which is the hallmark of poetic mind. So Pope is referred to simply as a versifier. He could, take up any prose matter, and with his skill of versification, he could convert it into a poetic piece. However, he lacked that original quality of a poet. So in this way, we find that how his reputation was questioned, but in the coming times, again, horizon of expectations changed, and Pope was again elevated as a great writer, having the twin qualities of literature in his work, or as F.R. Lewis was able to find that how Pope was having that metaphysical quality also in his work. So have you find that how horizon of expectations are changing? So evaluation of works or judgments of work, value judgments are also changing. So how can we say that a work has a universal appeal? Because at many times those attributes of greatness are put in question. So in this way, a literary work is not an object which stands by itself and which offers the same face to each reader in each period. So, Joss and other reader response theorists, by discussing this dynamic horizon of expectations, they try to make this point that the appeal of a work, it varies from age to age, and different readers from different geographical, historical, socio-cultural positions, they conceive that work differently. So one fixed meaning, one fixed value cannot be attached to a work of art. Right. So further, he goes on to say that we will never be able to survey the successive horizons which flow from the time of a work down to the present day, and then to sum up the work's final value or meaning. He says that, to do so would be to ignore our historical situation. He asks a number of questions, such as whose authority are we to accept? That of the first readers, or the combined opinion of readers over time, or the aesthetic judgment of the present. So, there we find that how Joss is saying that it is not that, we can sum up all the horizons, and in this way we can, sum up the work's final value of meaning. The fact is that if you do so, which point of view will you privilege? The first readers of that text, or, in between, or the combined opinion of all the readers, or readers who are analyzing or evaluating or interpreting a text at a given time. So in this way, Joss also borrows from the philosophical hermeneutics of Hans Georg Gadamer. He argues that all interpretations of past literature arise from a dialogue between past and present, right? So he says that this question of meaning is not confined to either a given time, current time, or it is wrong to understand a work of art, to interpret a work of art in context of the past in which it was produced. So he says that there is an interaction between the present and the past. Somehow, when we are talking about all these ideas that we come across the reader response criticism, whether it is the primacy of the reader or the death of the author, or this interaction between the past and present to make a sense of, how we are reminded of Eliot's distinction of empirical author and implied author, or his historical sense in which he talks about the simultaneous existence of the work of past and the work of present, or his two-way dimensional understanding of the concept of tradition or historical sense, in which it is not that only past is going to affect the present, but present also alters the status of a work in the past or produced in the past age. So in this way, we can always find a correlation between the views of these thinkers. And in this course, that is what I have tried to emphasize, a comparative estimate of these critics. So for example, to go ahead, Joss argues that uh, all interpretations of past literature arise from a dialogue between past and present. Our attempts to understand work will depend on the questions which our own cultural environment allows us to raise. Our present perspective always involves a relationship to the past, but at the same time, the past can only be grasped through the limited perspective of the present. So, if we look at these two statements, we find that these reader response critics are not saying that by adopting all those methods or by implying all those methods of reading or methods to the reading of a text or interpretation of a text, we can approach what is called a holistic meaning of the text, a total meaning of a text. That is not possible, right? Every meaning, every reading is an incomplete act of reading. Every interpretation is having lacks and lacunae. For example, he says that our sense of past, our approach to past is very limited. At the same time, our present time also allows us to raise certain kinds of questions. So there is always something which can be done. There is always a possibility in light of which the text can be read and which is not being done at the given time. So in this way, this incompleteness of the act of reading is again in consonance with the post-structuralist notion. So a hermeneutical notion of understanding does not separate the knower and the object in the familiar fashion of empirical science, but views understanding as a fusion of past and present. As we know that hermeneutics was originally a term applied to the interpretation of sacred text. Its modern equivalent preserves the same serious and reverent attitude towards the text to which it tries to gain access. So, Joss recognizes that a writer may directly affront the prevailing expectations of his or her day. For example, Joss also undertakes the examination of Baudelaire's famous collection, The Flowers of Evil, which was produced around 1857 or 58. And this work created an uproar when it appeared at that time. how it was subjected to a legal prosecution, and ultimately, Baudelaire was feeling very discouraged by this kind of reception of his work. This work was supposed to have offended the public morality, the sense of propriety that society feels. It, was considered to be a work which had profaned the sacred traditions, right? So, in this way, but after some time, this work was admired by the critics. Perhaps it was considered to be the first modern work in poetry, and its impact on the movement called decadence was also remarkable. So we find that soon after that they produced a new aesthetic horizon of expectations. The literary avant-garde saw the book as a trailblazing work of decadence, and the poems were concretized, to use Izo's terms, as expressions of aesthetic cult of nihilism. So, there we find that how, the work was uh, received differently with the change in the horizon of expectations. So the fusion of horizons is not a total merging of all points of view which have arisen, but only those which, to the hermeneutical sense of the critic, appear to be part of gradually emerging totality of meaning, which make up the true unity. Let us move to the discussion of another important reader response critic, who is Stanley Fish. Stanley Fish is an American critic who developed a reader oriented perspective called affective stylistics. Like Wolfgang Iser, Fish also concentrates on the adjustments of expectations to be made by readers as they pass along the text. For example, as we had seen in context of Wolfgang Iser, that how whatever values which were established in the text, the reader had to adjust his values according to the values of the text, and he had to review his opinions. So similarly, Fish also believes that these adjustments are very common that every reader has to make when one is interacting with the text. Fish separates its approach self consciously from all kinds of formalism by denying literary language any special status. His attention is instead directed towards the developing responses of the reader in relation to the works of sentences as they succeeded one another. For example, in Milton's Paradise Lost, describing the fall of angels, state of awareness, where, angel state of awareness is being described. So, if we look at this statement, nor did they not perceive the evil plight. We must attend, Fish argues, to the sequence of words which create a sense of suspension in the reader who hangs between the two views of falling angels' awareness. Or if we look at another sentence by Walter Pater, who says that this at last of flame like our life has, that it is but the concurrence, renewed from moment to moment, of forces parting sooner or later in their ways. Here, Fish points out that by interrupting concurrences of forces with renewed form, moment to moment, Pater prevents the reader from establishing a definite or stable image in mind. So, at each stage in the sentence, the reader is to make an adjustment in expectation and interpretation. For example, the idea of the concurrence is disrupted by parting, but then sooner or later leave the parting temporarily uncertain. So, the reader's expectation of meaning is thus continuously adjusted. The meaning emerges from the total movement of reading. So, in this way, Fish believes that his reading of sentences simply follows the natural practice of informed readers. In his view, a reader is someone who possesses a linguistic competence, a reader who has internalized the statements, cliches, quotations, or conventional associations. These versions are called hypograms, constituting a matrix which ultimately confers unity to a poem. For example, the reading process that Fish seems to encourage can be summarized as follows. Try to read for ordinary meaning, or highlight those elements which appear ungrammatical and which obstruct an ordinary mimetic interpretation. Discover the hypograms or commonplaces which receive expanded or unfamiliar expression in the text. And fourth, derive the metrics from hypograms, that is, find a single statement or word capable of generating hypograms and the text. Uh, Another very important work by Fish is there a text in this class. And in this work, Fish acknowledges that his earlier work treated his own experience of reading as the norm and goes on to justify this position by introducing the idea of interpretive communities. So, you know what Stanley Fish is trying to do here? He is trying to persuade readers to adopt a set of community assumptions so that when they read, they would do what I did. So, it emphasizes strategies of a particular interpretive community determine the process of reading or the stylistic facts of the subjects and experience of reading them. So, in this way, if we look at this dimension, we find that how this problem of the subject and the object, the perceiver and the perceived, it is solved in that way. And here we find that when Fish is talking about interpretive communities, you know, Fish is also trying to assert a kind of objective approach towards reading a text. Because if a text is to be read according to norms of interpretive communities, even if it is done by communities, but still, you know, out of shared subjectivity, some objectivity is going to be attained. So, in that way, any kind of deviant interpretation or possibility of a new interpretation or possibility of a resisting interpretation or, resistance to the norms, so that will be abandoned in that way. So, in this way, readers might not be very happy with that community, interpretive communities, right? So, in this way, we try to understand this reader response criticism movement in all its in all its aspects with different dimensions, and we have been able to discuss critics such as Stanley Fish, Hans Robert Jauss, or the theoretical framework of this movement. Wolfgang Iser and other thinkers have been discussed in detail. You have to follow this assignment for week 8. Read Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter. Show how Tom Jones is in dialogue with the reader who completes the text in light of Wolfgang Iser's ideas in 100 words. Delineate the difference of views on literary competence between Michael Refatere and Jonathan Culler in 200 words. And read David Blich's views on the shared subjectivities of the reader. So, with this, I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you.